Well, welcome everyone to the 33rd Annual McBride Lecture. My name is Marty Wolfson, and I'm the Director of the Higgins Labor Studies Program. The McBride Lecture Series is sponsored by the Higgins Program and is made possible by generous financial support from the United Steelworkers of America. This has been going on since 1978, and if you look in the back of your program, you can see the list of illustrious speakers that have come to Notre Dame as part of the McBride Lecture Series. The Higgins program throughout the year conducts a number of educational events and programs that attempt to address the questions, needs, and interests of people who work for a living. We invite you to participate in our activities. If you would like to be added to our email list to be notified of future events, please sign up at the table to the side of the hall. A lot of effort went into putting this program together tonight, and I want to particularly thank two leaders of the Higgins program, Dan Graff, the Associate Director, and Karen Manier, Program Coordinator, for all of their hard work and dedication. The Higgins program is pleased to be a part of the Center for Social Concerns, and we share the center's commitment to social justice. An activity of the center this year is the Notre Dame Pledge for Virtuous Discourse, which encourages respectful dialogue on campus and has been endorsed by President Jenkins. You can sign the pledge also at the table. At the conclusion of tonight's talk and question and answer period, we will have refreshments in the hallway. I've seen some of you have discovered this already. At 9 o'clock, we will be showing the presidential debate on the big screen, and we encourage all those who are interested to stay for the debate. Our speaker, Jarrod Bernstein, will lead and help moderate that discussion. We are quite fortunate tonight to have as our McBride lecturer Jarrod Bernstein. He is currently a senior fellow at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities and an on-air commentator for the cable stations CNBC and MSNBC. From 2009 to 2011, Bernstein was the chief economist and economic advisor to Vice President Joe Biden, executive director of the White House Task Force on the Middle Class, and a member of President Obama's economic team. Prior to joining the Obama administration, Bernstein was a deputy chief economist at the U.S. Department of Labor, and then a senior economist at the Economic Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. At EPI, he was the director of the Living Standards Program and a co-author of 9 editions of The State of Working America, considered by many people the definitive standard for understanding the economic situation of working people in this country. He is also the author of numerous books for both popular and academic audiences, including the book Crunch, Why Do I Feel So Squeezed? This book is a great example of Jarrod Bernstein's relatively rare ability to explain important economic issues in plain English. I know that's what he will do tonight as he speaks on rebuilding the American dream, the economic issues at stake, and the presidential election. It gives me great pleasure to welcome to Notre Dame, Jarrod Bernstein.
introduction. Thank you very much. It's great to see such a good, big crowd here, diverse crowd, lots of different young people, old people. Me, I'm kind of an old person. It's also wonderful to get out of D.C. It's always good to, and maybe that's a little weird to say, but I live in a place that I always like to leave. It's a great place to live, but there are a lot of weird things going on there right now, which I'll talk to you about in a second. I've been to Notre Dame before, and I've never spent enough time here. I tend to come in and leave much too quickly. I'd like to learn more about it. Somebody told me that the famous Touchdown Jesus is around here somewhere. It's in this building, I guess. I still haven't seen it, so I want to see that. My sister-in-law has a niece who goes here, Becky Salentic. Is Becky here? Becky, are you here? I was about to call Julie and tell her you weren't here. I want to talk about a lot of gnarly stuff that I'm going to try to do, like Marty said, in a way that's interesting and hopefully a little entertaining, all in advance of this very important first debate between President Obama and Governor Romney. So this is a unique kind of moment for us. I mean, we get to talk about economics and budget politics and all the stuff that I think they're going to talk about, and then we can actually hear them talking about it. For those who are in here for the long haul, then we can, I guess, come back together or stay in this room and talk a little bit more about what we just heard. So put your seatbelts on, I guess, is the operative thought. I'm going to kind of zip through a bunch of slides. This is in some ways almost more for me just to organize my thinking as we go through here. I don't want you to pay too much attention to what's up here in the PowerPoint. Just try to listen to what I'm saying about it. And if you have questions, make sure you write them down or you remember them, because, as I said, there's a lot of information I'm going to be covering here, and some of it can be confusing for those of us who don't live and muck around in this stuff all day long. And I do find sometimes in crowds like this with this kind of information, people are a little shy about asking questions. And I strongly urge you to put that aside. I really mean it when I say there are no bad questions when it comes to this kind of information. There may be bad answers, that would be my problem. But there are definitely no bad questions, so keep that in mind. This is an election that is about the role of government. I don't know that I've ever seen or been privy to, at least in my politically conscious life, an election that so starkly presented a choice about the role of government in our economy and in our economic lives. I'm going to say very little about the foreign policy side of this, obviously, as an economist and someone who's worked in the political economy through parts of my career. I'm going to focus on domestic issues on the economy, which is the subject of tonight's debate. The two candidates, the two parties, have evolved into very different views about this question of the role of government, and more precisely, the question of what's the proper function? What are the proper functions of a government in advanced economies like ours, or say those of Western Europe, economies that are often structured different from ours, but are very much the kind of modern economies versus the more emerging economies like China and India or something like that. What's the proper function? That's what this debate is going to be about tonight. That's what my talk is going to be about. And frankly, I believe that's what this election is about. The question really is not, does one side believe in markets and private markets and the things that the market sector versus the public sector or the government sector can do. It's not a matter of one side believes that the government should do everything and the other side believes the private sector should do everything. That's not the debate at all, because both sides very much believe that markets and market forces should dominate. It's a matter of where you draw the line. And I think a good way to understand where you draw the line is to wrap your head around the concept of market failures. Okay? So we have this economic market, and those of you in the room who study economics know that it's just a conglomeration of different markets. There's the stock market, there's the labor market, there's the market for goods, there's the market for services, and there's a market for cars, there's a market for haircuts, etc. Put that all together and you have the private side of the economy. But there's also a public side of the economy that provides lots of things that the private sector doesn't. So for example, if we left it simply to markets on the private side of the economy, there wouldn't be enough education. There simply is no structure embedded in private markets that would provide an ample amount of, say, educational services. Nobody would build the roads. It's actually, no one would build the infrastructure, the roads, the bridges, the water systems, even the airport. So the question is not one of one side believes in market, the others are socialist European Soviet 5-year planners. You hear that kind of stuff thrown around, but it's completely just name calling or dog whistling. It's not really true. The fact of the case is that both sides believe in market forces, and both sides believe in a role for the public sector. But they draw the line in very different places. And to understand where you yourself, and I especially am talking to the younger people here who may not have quite figured out where they draw the line. All the oldsters like me probably think we have it figured out already. But I'm particularly talking to younger people now. I want you to think to yourself where you yourself would draw the line in terms of here's something I believe there's a role for government, and here's something where I'd like to see government sort of stand aside and not play a role, not intervene. In my view, and Marty mentioned I used to work for the Economic Policy Institute, and Marty's done some work for them as well. One of the things that I always kind of tried to describe EPI, the Economic Policy Institute, where I used to work, that we saw market failures around more corners than a lot of other economists. So I probably am going to talk about ways in which private sector markets don't accomplish many of the very important functions within our economy. So I would draw the line in a different place than a more conservative person who doesn't see it that way. And I want to be very upfront about that without endorsing one candidate or the other. So where you draw this line will be very much a function of how you view things that the private market does well and areas where the private market fails. Retirement security is the first thing that comes to mind. And here I'm thinking about income security, which for many people is Social Security, and healthcare security, which for many older people past their working years is Medicare. You're going to hear something about both of them tonight, probably more about Medicare, because Medicare is a policy that is in need of some architectural shifting around, some restructuring. Social Security is too. It's somewhat less pressing than Medicare, and neither candidate is talking about it. Neither candidate has said, here's how I think we should fix Social Security. But Medicare they have talked about. It's my view that the private sector, left to its own devices, would not provide adequate retirement security. And in fact, government can provide retirement security in the areas of income security and healthcare security much more efficiently for actually less money than the private sector could. Now, part of this has to do with the fact that we have lots of elderly people who are past their working years who don't have a lot of income. In fact, the typical family, or I should say the typical beneficiary of Social Security or Medicare has an income of around $22,000, $23,000. An annual income of $22,000, $23,000. That's the typical beneficiary. And if you think about that for a second, clearly that person would have a very hard time providing adequately for their own income security or their own health care security when they're past their working years. So every single advanced economy, in fact most emerging economies as well, have figured out that we have to have programs in place to provide retirement security for people past their working lives. So that's the first way in which the market left to its own devices won't provide the needed security for people in their mid-60s and up. And what you're going to probably hear tonight is some debates about what's the best way to run those programs, particularly Medicare, as I mentioned. And Republicans argue that what we ought to do is inject more private competition into the Medicare program, and Democrats argue that no, in fact, private competition won't be particularly helpful. Now, we're going to have a lot of time for questions and answers, and people can ask me about this, and I can go into greater detail as to my own views on this. But I can tell you one thing. The plan that, that Republicans have put forth for Medicare does, in fact, save money to the Medicare system. And it does that by providing, instead of a guaranteed insurance program that, as Medicare currently exists, it provides people with a voucher, which is basically a receipt to go buy health care from some insurer out there. And if the insurer costs more than the voucher, then you have to pay the difference yourself. And if you think about how that would work as time progresses, basically, you will save the government money. But you'll only save the government money by shifting the expense of buying health care insurance onto the beneficiary themselves. So it's really not a cost saving, it's a cost shifting. And that's different. So I'll get into that a little bit more later. There is a very important regulatory function that you'll also hear something about tonight. The private sector, particularly financial market institutions in the private sector. Here I'm thinking about the big investment banks, and if you know much about the meltdown that we had back in 07, 08, you know that a lot of banks were stuck with a lot of bad loans, and the financial system really froze up for a while there. It led us into this really quite devastating recession that we're still digging out of. One of the reasons that occurred, and this is widely agreed upon, I mean conservatives and liberals largely agree on this point. One of the reasons that occurred was because of inadequate oversight and the very pervasive belief that financial firms at these banks could regulate themselves. That the market incentives were such that no financial institution would take out bad loans, would underwrite, would essentially let people borrow money who couldn't pay it back, that somehow the system itself would self-police, would self-regulate. That proved to be a catastrophic belief, one that was largely based on mathematical modeling and not really based on real-life experiences that, frankly, economists since Adam Smith have been writing about. The volatility and the tendency to implode of financial markets was very well known, and in fact has created a cycle. I actually have dubbed it, in a later slide, I've dubbed it the shampoo cycle, because it's bubble, bust, repeat. So there has to be a regulatory function. There has to be a government oversight function when it comes to financial markets. Now, interestingly, both candidates again agree on this. The president, and I worked on this myself when I was there, working for the administration, passed a financial reform bill. But the Republicans, they don't like that. They say they want to repeal it and replace it with something else. They haven't been specific about what they want to replace it with, but they're not saying we should repeal that and just let everything go back to the way it was. They're saying we should repeal that and replace it with something else. And one of the things you may have heard about, if you've heard some of the critiques around the election, is that people say we want more specifics. Well, there's an example where you might hear some more specifics tonight, though on that point I kind of doubt it. Keynesian demand-side policies. This is another biggie and one of my personal favorites. Certainly, I know there are some economic students in here, but probably some who aren't. But it's pretty hard to miss the fact, especially here in Indiana, where the unemployment rate was in high double digits in some of the towns around here. I know because I remember going to Elkhart with the administration. You couldn't have missed that we had a Great Recession, and talk about market failure. That is a massive, cataclysmic market failure, where GDP, the value of the goods and services in the economy, if you aggregate them all together and you add them all up, it turns out it's around 15 trillion. So a nice chunk of change there is the value of the goods and services that comprise our economy. GDP was falling at an annual rate of 9%. That hasn't happened since the Great Depression of the 1930s. That was in the fourth quarter of 2008 when the Obama economic team was getting together for the very first time. That's what was going on outside our windows. So cataclysmic market failure. At times like that, it has been established since the great British economist John Maynard Keynes that there is a role, a temporary role, for the public sector to offset what's called the demand contraction, to offset the fact that the private sector simply isn't creating the economic activity, the jobs, the consumer demand, just basically the kinds of exchange of money for goods and services that make an economy percolate along. In the absence of a private sector that was kind of doing that for you, you need to intervene and try to offset those big losses that were occurring in the private sector, that big GDP contraction, with temporary stimulus. And that means government spending, typically deficit spending, borrowed money government spending that is targeted at helping put people back to work. Some of it was, about $280 billion of it were tax cuts. And typically people hopefully take that and they spend it, and that creates more consumer demand. But some of it was infrastructure, building roads, bridges, fixing schools, things like that. Actually, now that I think of it, the school fixing thing we took out of the bill, which I thought was very unfortunate, but that's a different story. But anyway, infrastructure, helping the states whose budgets were very tight. So that's another well-established, this is an interesting point. It's a very well-established market failure with a very well-established role for government, and yet it's quite controversial right now. There are lots of people running around Washington arguing, our country really, arguing that this stuff doesn't work. I think they're profoundly wrong, but if you want a great read on this, there's a very good new book that I think takes an even-handed look at this, though it comes out very supportive of the Keynesian stimulus that we applied in the Recovery Act. It's a book by Michael Grunwald called The New Deal, very good book. I'm going to skip the next one because I'm going to get back to it in a minute. Safety net. When you have a market failure of the magnitude of the Great Recession, poverty tends to go up. People lose their jobs. That's unless you're someone who's a big trader in the stock market with lots of stuff in your bond portfolio. Once you lose your job, you're toast. The vast majority of not just working Americans, but of working age American families depend on paychecks, not stock portfolios. So once they lose their job, they need help. So another very important role of government is to strengthen the safety net, especially when there's a recession. And that's things like unemployment insurance. The nutritional program, it's now called SNAP, but it used to be called Food Stamps, Supplemental Nutritional Assistance, but now it's called, it used to be food stamps, now it's SNAP. That's expanded a great deal to provide lots of nutrition assistance to over 40 million people right now. Medicaid, health insurance for people who lose their jobs and whose incomes are very low. Another part of the safety net that expanded considerably in the Great Recession. And by the way, for many people, it's quite recessionary even when the economy is percolating along. I mean, if the unemployment rate, which is 8.1% in the nation, but if the unemployment rate fell to 5 or 6%, you'd still have lots of groups of people, African Americans, for example, facing double-digit unemployment rates. People who, unlike many of those in this room, didn't get a college education, much higher unemployment rates. So you need a safety net in good times and bad times. And again, this is not something that both sides disagree on, but they disagree a lot on how significant it should be, on how well it should be funded. And in fact, and here I will criticize a conservative idea, the conservatives have been particularly Paul Ryan, the vice presidential candidate. And I know this, we know this because he's also the chairman of the House Budget Committee in the Congress. So he's actually written budgets, and his budget cuts $5 trillion of spending over 10 years, which is actually quite a bit. And 60% of 60% of those spending cuts come from low-income programs. So these folks argue that the safety net should be cut. And in fact, Paul Ryan has said the problem with the safety net is it's become a hammock, that people are using it in ways that incentivize laziness instead of using it when they really need it. And so one of the things that they've suggested is we should just give the states a certain amount of money to run food stamps, to run Medicaid, to run all these programs, and we'll just give them a set amount of money every year, the same amount, or maybe we'll grow it for inflation, but every year we'll just give the states a fixed block grant, and we'll let them run the program, and then the federal government won't have to worry about it. It'll be a savings for the federal government. That's another example of the same thing I talked about with Medicare. It's not cost saving, it's cost shifting. And when you shift costs, all you're doing is making somebody else pay more for something that the federal government is no longer footing the bill for. So you're not really solving a problem, you're just making it someone else's problem. And I'm quite critical of that. One reason I'm critical of that is because we tried it with welfare, which is cash assistance for typically single moms who are poor. And we saw that the benefits of this program did not adjust at all when the economy went into recession. See, that's the problem with this block granting. The problem with this idea of block granting is that in economics terms, you lose the counter-cyclical function of the program. Now let me explain what that means. When the economy goes into recession, safety net programs have to strengthen because of the dynamics I explained before with people losing their jobs. And if you just block grant these programs and give folks the same amount of money every year, give states the same amount of money every year, it won't be able, the programs won't be able to expand. So they won't be able to meet the market failure that I'm describing here. So that's, those are some of the issues that I think are likely to come up tonight in this area of the role of government and the really pretty starkly different views with Democrats believing that every one of these market failures demands a significant role for government, and Republicans not nearly so convinced. Part 2. I've talked about these two different views of the role of government in quite a normative way. That is, so far I've tried to be, although my colors, my stripes definitely show, I'm not trying to hide anything, but I've tried to talk about this pretty much descriptively, without much of a thumb on the scale. But in fact, in much of my writing, particularly in a book I wrote, I think around 10 years ago now, I talked about these two visions of a role of government in the following framework. You're on your own, or yo-yo, versus wit. We're in this together. Interestingly, if you heard Bill Clinton's speech at the Democratic Convention, he used this terminology, you're on your own versus we're in this together. And I thought he used it very effectively, far more effectively than I did, frankly, but, he's gifted that way. And I want you to think about this role of government question, and I want you to listen to the debates tonight with this continuum in mind. A view that on one perspective from government is really, you're on your own, it's a private market out there, here's a voucher, go buy some health insurance. That's the best way to run a program. You're a state, here's a block grant, run your food stamp program, good luck. Many of the, in fact, Paul Ryan himself talked about privatizing Social Security. Instead of having a guaranteed Social Security benefit, you invest that money in the stock market, and it's very much up to you as an investor. You're on your own. Good luck. See how it works out for you. If you're a smart investor, it's going to be great for you. Better than you'd get through the Social Security program. And if you're not, hey, it's capitalism. Some people win, some people lose. And interestingly, and I say this here at Notre Dame, and I had dinner tonight with some very really enjoyable dinner with members of the community here, a number of who worked in the religious part of the university. And I say this to you I say this to you in thinking about Catholic teachings and the role of Catholic teaching in our responsibility for taking care of each other. When the Catholic bishops took a close look at the kinds of ideas that Paul Ryan put in his budget vis-a-vis low-income programs, they wrote a pretty scathing letter saying that this is not our belief of how government ought to operate. And I thought that the Catholic bishops had a strong point. It's not like, these are not folks who intervene in something like a budget proposal without thinking pretty carefully about it. But I think that they recognize that there's too much of you're on your own in there when really we're in this together model, which addresses all of those measures on the last slide: an amply funded public sector, rejection of a trickle-down focus on opportunity, not equal outcomes. Let me talk about that for a second. A very key component, and you're going to hear about this in tonight's debate. This is when they talk about when President Obama jumps all over Governor Romney for his tax plan. This is what I think he's going to be talking about. Trickle-down economics. Here the idea is, again, I think very much from the you're on your own, what I call yo-yo economics. The idea is that if you cut taxes for the wealthiest people, they will, by dint of having more after-tax income, create more economic activity. They will buy more factories, those factories will hire more people, and the economy will do a lot better than if we have the same tax regime we have right now. And so Governor Romney has proposed very significant tax cuts that are heavily weighted to those at the very top of the income scale. We also know, and this has come up in this election season, that the income of the wealthiest Americans, particularly income that comes from assets, things like appreciating stocks and your bond portfolio, those kinds of things, the accounts in the Cayman Islands, those kinds of income sources are treated very preferentially in the tax code. That's, the idea behind that is trickle-down economics. That if you shower goodies and benefits on the most wealthy, that the economic activity that they generate will trickle down and help everybody else. The problem with the idea, while it may sound logical to folks, is that we've actually had a pretty careful, a pretty thorough test of that in the Bush years, the George W. Bush years. That was very much a period of trickle-down economics. The banks in the financial sector were deregulated, a process that actually began under Democratic administrations, and taxes were cut for people at the top, etc. In fact, they even tried to privatize Social Security that year. It didn't work, and interestingly, it didn't work because when they tried to privatize it, they just got the timing wrong, and the stock market was tanking. And everyone was, well, why would I want to invest in the stock market that's going down? But they tried. And I think the record on the supply side stuff is bad, and you'll hear that tonight. You'll hear the president probably say, we tried that, didn't work. That's something that he's said before. Now, here's the part of we're in this together that I'd like to focus on for probably the rest of my talk, and then I'll get out of the way and field your questions. I mentioned an amply funded public sector, focusing on equal opportunities but not equal outcomes. We have in this country levels of income inequality that we haven't seen literally since the late 1920s. I actually have a slide of that I'll show you briefly. I always bring more slides than I'm going to use. This just shows this slide on the right here. I have a little pointer. This slide on the right here just shows the real increase in the income of the top 1% versus everybody else. So, there's everybody else. There's the top 1%. Since 1979, they're up almost 300%, and you can see everybody else is down here. If you ask yourself, what share of national income has accrued to the top 1%? Back in 1929 or 28, almost 25% of national income went to the top 1%, right before the Great Depression kind of evened things out. Well, it was just that high, almost exactly the same level in 2007 before the Great Recession. It fell with the Great Recession, but you can see it's already climbing back up again. So we have a serious problem with, we have a, okay, sorry, there, oops. We have a serious inequality problem. And you may hear this tonight in the following framework. And it's the one very much that I feel quite strongly about. And I'll be very interested if this resonates with folks in here. Again, not just from an economic perspective or even a good public policy perspective, but in part from an ethical perspective. It is not my goal, or I think the goal of progressives, or certainly not of the Obama administration, who I don't represent anymore, but who I used to work for, to pursue equal outcomes. People often say, when you start talking about inequality, hey, there's always going to be inequality in a capitalist economy. You guys want everyone to have the same economic outcomes. You want everybody to have the same income. You want there to be no inequality. Everybody has, the average income so that there's no variance there. No, it'll never happen, and it shouldn't happen, and it won't happen. And you don't see that in any economy. You don't even see that in socialist or communist economies, and you certainly don't see it in capitalist economies. You never have, you never will, and you shouldn't. But what you should see, what I think you really should strive for, is not equal outcomes, but equal opportunities. By the fact that you were born to a poor family shouldn't mean that you're going to be stuck in poverty. It shouldn't mean that you won't have the access to the kinds of institutions like this one that will give you the opportunity to realize your economic potential, your intellectual potential, your spiritual potential. It's not about equal outcomes, it's about equal opportunity. And here's the connection that I want to make about that. Forget the top few lines. Focus on where it says the inequality wedge. Here's what's happening. This little thing where it says inequality wedge, that's my model of the economy. I've been working in this business for decades, and I finally wrote down what I think it all means. That's my formula of everything, for what it's worth. In a normal economy, you have growth. The growth goes to different families. Some at the bottom get some in the middle get some. In fact, if you look at the data on this, it's actually quite clear that for many years, this graph just shows income growth of low-income, middle-income, and high-income families. For about 3 decades in the post-World War II era, incomes grew at the same rate for families at the middle, the bottom, and the top. They both just about doubled. Yeah, it goes from 50 to 100. This is all indexed in a way so you can plot them on the same scale. But the incomes just about doubled from the mid-40s to the mid-70s. So in a normal economy, without this inequality wedge, the economy grows, and growth finds its way to high-income, middle-income, and low-income families. It doesn't mean that low-income families one year become rich the next year, but it does mean that as they work and participate in the economy, contribute to the economy's productivity growth, they get ahead. And that increases their living standards. They find themselves with more opportunities and more mobility. Put the inequality wedge in there, and that all breaks down. Once you have the problem that we face now, where growth, economic growth, GDP growth, all those numbers that you hear every quarter, industrial production up, capital goods up, GDP up, that growth is being channeled disproportionately to those at the very top of the income scale, and poverty rates have, of course, been going up, not just in the recession, but before the recession. Even as the economy was expanding in the 2000s, poverty actually went up, it didn't go down, because growth was diverted from those at the lower end Wages were stagnant for middle-income people. They haven't gone anywhere for years. Median wages, the wage of the person right in the middle of the income scale, if you adjust it for inflation, it's a little better for women than for men, but if you just look at median wages, they're pretty much where they are now compared to where they were 30 years ago, despite the fact that, the economy is much more productive. And in fact, if you want to, I have, I think, a pretty compelling picture of that, same kind of thing. Oops, keep doing that, sorry. Shouldn't be that hard. Yeah, look at this. This just plots productivity growth, which is just how productive the workforce is. It's just how much output the workforce is creating per hour of work. And you can see that, productivity has been growing forever. And for decades, compensation, hourly wages and compensation, including benefits, grew in lockstep with productivity. But look at this gap. This is inequality. That's what I'm talking about when I talk about the inequality wedge. It's that space in there. As that wedge has evolved, it's not just that there's more inequality, it's that there's less opportunity. There's less access to opportunity. Think about someone who's stuck in a neighborhood with a lousy school, with lousy libraries, with lousy parks, with lousy air, with lousy health care. Some of the slides I have here, and I'm not going to go into them in the interest of time, show things like the amount of money that parents are actually spending on their kids, in what we call enrichment goods. I live in Alexandria, Virginia. Practically every day, my kids, 13 and 10, have something to do after school. There's a soccer game, there's a lacrosse game, there's Girl Scouts, there's piano lessons. That's opportunity. There's summer camp, there's trips to the museum, there's vacations. As inequality has increased and those wedges have got into the picture, there's less opportunity than there should be. And that's diminished mobility and concentrated influence. This inequality, especially in a world where money is so pervasive in politics, is reinforcing itself. It's buying the politics that reinforces more inequality and blocking the policies that would, as the title of my lecture tonight was, would rebuild the American dream. And so that's what I want to talk about now in closing. I didn't just want to talk about the debates, because frankly, and I'll watch them very closely, and I'll be very, very interested, but there is a bit of a horse race to the whole thing, and a lot of fluff and a lot of nonsense, and just a lot of silliness. This, in particular, it seems this season has been fraught with nonsense. So I didn't want to just stop at the debates. I have a chance to come out here and talk to you all, and you've been good enough to come out here tonight and hang out with me a bit. I wanted to talk about what the big problems are and what we should be doing about them. Some of that you'll hear in the debates, but some of that you won't. The first few bullets, you can read them to yourself if you want. We can talk about them later. But I'm just going to start with what I think ought to be done to close that wedge. Because we are now very much stuck in an economic cycle where far too many people are falling behind. They are not having access, this is called Rebuild the American Dream. That sounds very, highfalutin. But to me, that means access to opportunity. Rebuilding a pathway to opportunity so that nobody is blocked from achieving their potential. Now, if their potential is such that the best they can hope for is to be a home health aide or a security guard versus a rocket scientist, that's fine. I know we're going to create a lot of jobs for security guards and home health aides. I know that. I want those to be good jobs, by the way, which often means unions. But I do know that there are lots of people who are stuck in those occupations who could be doing a lot better if they've had access to better opportunities. Full employment. We're stuck at 8% unemployment right now, but it's been as high as 10, and of course, in Indiana, it was even worse. It's getting better. The momentum is in the right direction. You're going to hear a lot about that tonight. The president will say the word 5 million jobs. We should probably, take a drink every time you hear 5 million, a drink of water, that is. The president will talk about 5 million private sector jobs. So things are moving in the right direction, and he's got some interesting momentum. By the way, I meant to say, I write a blog, JarrodBernsteinBlog.com. I hope you will all check it out. I importune you to check it out, because if it's not accessible to people like you, then I've got to start doing something differently. So let me know, write a comment, say if this is... But I've been writing about this lately, about this kind of electoral calculus and how the economy is playing out in the election. In fact, I just wrote a piece today. I finished it in my hotel room at the Morris Inn, all about this issue of why is the president doing better in the polls when the economy is posting some not so great numbers. So if you want to try to think about that, I was riffing off of a very nice article in the National Journal called Defying Gravity. They're arguing the president's defying the gravity of these statistics. And I think it has a lot to do with the momentum, even though it's not strong enough. It is moving in the right direction. In the short term, we need to we need to implement more of the kinds of job measures that were in the Recovery Act. I'm telling you, many of these measures really helped. Some of them were more effective than others, for sure, but many of these measures helped. And in the short run, we need to do more of that. About a year ago, the president actually presented a plan called the American Jobs Act that was intended to do that. And in some ways, I viewed as kind of insurance against the very kind of economic slog that we're stuck in now, but Congress wouldn't look at it. So we very much need our elected representatives to take this short-term issue seriously and provide more fiscal policy to help generate more short-term jobs. That's not what drives the budget deficit. The short-term temporary stuff doesn't hurt the budget deficit much at all. But in the longer term, we're going to need more jobs. So I would argue that one of the things you want to listen to tonight, and I'm not sure you're going to get it from either side, but one of the things you need to listen to for tonight is what's your jobs plan? What's a concrete plan that I can understand? You don't have to be a PhD economist. And it can't just be elect me and there'll be 12 million more jobs. It's got to be a little bit more specific. End the shampoo economy, bubble bust, repeat. I can't emphasize this enough. You know, one of the things we try to do in policies like job creation is to think about ways that we can create more employment. Earlier there was a quick slide that talked about investment. I said I'd get back to that. I actually think investment is very important. There are, and it's another one of these market failures. There are investments that the private sector won't make to the magnitude that we need. So for example, if you look over the history of the American economy, things that really made a difference, the internet, railroads, going back to the very beginning, you know, machine tools, transistors, GPS, lasers. There is no private sector company that can do that by itself. There's no individual firm that can invest in the research and development, in the infrastructure. Think of railroads. Think of a smart grid. Think of advanced battery technology. When we were at the White House, we decided that some country is going to dominate in the manufacturing and production of advanced batteries, battery storage of energy. That's absolutely got to be the case. Why shouldn't it be us, as opposed to Japan or Brazil or Spain? And Spain is not a word right now, but that's a different discussion. And so we made considerable investments in advanced battery technology that would never have been made by the private sector itself. If we don't provide adequate oversight to the financial market system, it will continue to bubble, bust, and repeat. We'll be stuck in the shampoo cycle. If you don't like the Dodd-Frank financial reform, that's fine. We can have a good talk about what there should be. But we must end the shampoo economy. The tax debate is a mess, and there is I'll talk about this and just the last thing, and then I'll stop. You'll hear about this tonight, so let me talk about this for a second. There are two basic arguments about taxes right now. One says we need more revenue if we're going to be able to fulfill the kinds of functions I talked about in my very first slide. If you believe that these market failures are demanding of government action, if you believe there's a role for government in these areas where the market doesn't carry you, the private market doesn't get you, you need an amply funded government to do that. There are, Governor Romney has proposed very large tax cuts that amount to $5 trillion over 10 years. Tax cuts that he argues can be paid for, but has been very unspecific about how to do that. Maybe we'll hear more specifics today. He's actually been starting to get a bit more specific, and I think it's been helpful. But the president has argued, no, we're going to have to increase some people's taxes. And I think the president is right about that. We're just not collecting enough revenue to adequately perform these roles. Now, what you're going to hear, maybe not tonight, but somewhere in your life, and it might be in an economics class, and if you hear it, feel free to put your headset on and just do something else for a little while, because I think economists get this wrong. What you're going to hear is that if tax rates are increased even a little bit, everybody's going to stop working and the economy is going to grind to a halt. I mean, it may not be put quite like that, but what you will hear, I mean, I have these debates, believe me. There are a lot of people who believe this, or at least they say they believe it. And their idea is that any increase in taxes is going to just, it's the opposite of the supply side story. The supply side story says you cut taxes, people work harder, better things happen. If you raise taxes, everybody stops working. It's wrong on the theory, because it emphasizes only one side of tax theory, the substitution effect for you micro students, not the income effect. That's real too. But it's empirically, it just hasn't been found to be the case. And very smart, mathematically oriented tax economists are looking at this now and arguing that, in fact, we could see very large increases in our marginal tax rates without the kinds of economic cataclysm that gets advertised. So that'll be an interesting part of the debate. My view, very strongly, we're going to have to collect more revenue if we're going to fulfill the government roles that I've elaborated for you here tonight. And then finally, I won't go back to the last slide, but it happens to intersect with my last point there. I can't emphasize enough as I close out my part of the talk, and then I'll take your questions. I can't emphasize enough the depth of the inequality problem that we're facing. It was very striking to me to see, and not at all surprising, but striking for me to see that line at the very end of the inequality graph I showed you start to take off again. The economy's been growing since the middle of 2009. The economy has been growing. GDP has been growing since mid-2009. It's now, we're now towards the, moving towards the end of 2012. And yet, middle-class incomes are way down. The growth has to be going somewhere. Well, it's just finding its way to the top. And I don't care if it's Barack Obama or Mitt Romney or Paul Ryan or Joe Biden or some combination therein. But I am looking, and I hope you are too, for a political system that will take these problems seriously, will recognize that an economy that grows yet doesn't lift its members as it grows, that leaves large chunks of people behind, is not a sustainable economy. It's not sustainable in terms of the kinds of, it's not sustainable in terms of the kinds of opportunity arguments I was making before. I don't believe it's an ethically sustainable economy either. And I think that's actually a good place to close out, especially here at Notre Dame, where I know that kind of thinking is something you carry around in your hearts. As we look at the debate tonight and we consider these issues, let's watch it with our eyes and think about it with our heads, but let's also feel it with our hearts from the perspective of inequality and opportunity and giving everybody a fair shake in this economy. Thank you very much.
Professor Graff has a microphone, and if you indicate you'd like to ask a question, he's right over here, and he'll come around and let you use the microphone. We will have questions and answers until 8:45, at which time we will stop for refreshments and then reconvene here at 9 o'clock for the debate.
Do you want to call on people, or do you appoint, or you just want to?
You can decide then. All right.
Is this on?
Hi.
Hi.
So I'm a psychology student. I've never taken an economics class before. And this is something that I've kind of always wondered about when we started to touch on it. So I'm wondering if you can shed some light. That graph that you showed with the 3 levels of income
Yep.
that are split up.
Right here, was this one?
Actually, back one more. Sorry, other way. That one.
Okay.
Yeah. I think, I don't know. Okay. Well,
Those are all the graphs I showed.
my question is, for either party, no matter which party you're part of, what is the goal of this earning money thing? Because if we said that before, the rates of income are increasing the same for all 3 income levels.
Oh yeah, okay, that's a different graph.
Okay.
I know which one you're talking about.
Yes.
This one.
Okay. So they were all increasing the same up until 1980 or so.
Right.
And then they split up and we have all these problems. I agree that these are all problems. But my question is, what would happen if they all just kept growing at the same rate? I mean, wouldn't it have to stop sometime? What can we get from all of that going together?
Well, it's actually interesting. We have the data go back to like the mid-40s, and we have these 2 periods. One period they grew together, and another period they grew apart. And I'm not exactly sure I understand your question, but I guess where I would go with it is, like, how do you know kind of what's right or what's normal? Like, which period is, maybe this is just, not maybe, but, maybe the structure, clearly the structure of the economy was such that incomes grew together here, and the structure of the economy was such that they grew apart here, and who's to say one is better than another? Well, the problem is not that incomes are growing at, the problem is less that incomes are growing at the same pace here and not here. It's that essentially, for pretty long periods of time, like this part I'm circling right here, is the business cycle of the 2000s and the Great Recession, and this right here is the 1980s. Now in the 90s things were a little different. For pretty long periods of time, in fact if you looked at that other slide, I think, if you looked at that other slide, for pretty long periods of time, it's not just that incomes or wages weren't growing as fast as somebody else's, it's that they weren't growing at all. And if your wage is flat, if your income is pretty flat, it's pretty hard to improve your living standards. And, I wrote this book called Crunch, Why Do I Feel So Squeezed? You've got a lot of families, and this has actually gotten worse since I wrote the book. Clearly I haven't been as effective as I need to be. You got a lot of people saying, I feel like I'm working harder, but I'm falling further behind. The things that kind of comprise the living standard goals of my family, being able to save for retirement, a decent house in a good neighborhood with good schools, the ability to send kids to, save and send my kids to a good college without becoming horribly indebted, even the ability to take a vacation or to not be stressed just making the monthly goal. These become harder and harder. And that's the kind of disconnect that I think is problematic when you're talking about a period like this one versus that one. It's not that incomes have to grow together. It's that everyone who's contributing to growth ought to be able to get something back for it. If the pie is growing and only one slice is getting bigger, I think something's fundamentally wrong. Oh, we got a lot of questions now. So you opened up a floodgate here. So, Mr. Microphone, do you want to?
Yes.
Okay.
My question is concerning the role of government. I've heard it argued many times that certain parts of the social safety net and social welfare should be not the role of government, but met by private charities and churches and other such things. I want to know how you would respond to people who make that argument. And I think you might respond by saying that markets won't create the charities that can meet that need, and the government could do so more efficiently. And if that is how you would respond, could you tell me how and why that is true?
Well, I think that the churches and charities do play a role, should play a role, and will continue to play a role. But you need a plan B. You need both. I myself try to, I myself and many members of my community are engaged in charity around providing food to less advantaged people around where I live. And that's great, and it helps a lot of people. But what if we don't make it? What if they don't have the contributions? Particularly in a downturn, in a recession where charity typically falls off. You need a backup plan. So I guess it comes down. I think the best way to explain this would be to invoke the countercyclical function I mentioned earlier. When the economy hits a recession, as it did in 2008, 2009, and continues to struggle with, folks are much less able to contribute to their churches and their charities. And that's when the need is the greatest. So in good times, I think charities and such can be counted on as long as people are feeling charitable, which is another variable. And I don't know how to control that. I think the importance of a safety net to be sure that you're going to catch people when they fall is something we have to have to back up a charitable system that certainly can't expand to meet need when need is most urgent.
Could you comment on the fiscal cliff, and do you think that there's a chance for a reasonable compromise and a good plan with a lame duck Congress?
Sure. Just so everybody understands this, there are these kinds of time release capsules with some tax increase and spending cut policies that as of the beginning of next year, over $500 billion of fiscal contraction will occur. That is, taxes will go up by about $400 billion in 1 year, and spending will be cut by around $100 billion in 1 year. That's a lot of a drag on the economy. And if that happens, we'll go into another recession, very likely. That's called the fiscal cliff, and it has to do with the way policies are set to expire, unfortunately. And Congress has never had the wherewithal to fix it, to extend or to put in a set of tax and spend policies that don't have that kind of cataclysmic impact. I'm afraid we probably are going to go over the fiscal cliff because I don't see the political combination that avoids it. My hope, though, is that once the election is resolved, regardless of which candidate wins, that there'll be enough grown-ups in the room in Washington to avoid the worst of the cliff. So I think we have to go over it, but only perhaps for a few weeks, maybe in January or so, maybe February. They'll be able to craft a plan that offsets the impact of the cliff. And if that's the case, I don't think it will be recessionary. It's not a good scenario. It's not a good solution. But I think after the election, some of the pressures that are pushing us off the cliff will be behind us.
You spoke about the inequality wedge, and in conjunction with the stagnation of wage increase in comparison with the increase in productivity. And I'm curious as to what kind of policies do you think contributed to that, and what are some policies that could possibly improve it for the future?
Sure. I'm going to just, I think, yeah. So I did bring a slide on the main causes of rising U.S. income inequality, and you can read them there. I don't want to go through them all in the interest of time. Globalization, less unions, higher unemployment, technical change, the minimum wage is too low, tax code, too much financial deregulation, as I mentioned in my talk. These are all the kind. That's my diagnosis and that's my prescription. Probably the most important one there for me is number 3. I think the best way to offset inequality, particularly in the job market, which again is the source of a lot of this, is to have very tight labor markets. I don't know if you remember, and I don't want to try to find it, but there was an earlier slide where I said, there's a little circle there and it showed incomes going up. Well, that was when the economy, that was in the 90s. So the structure of the economy wasn't that different than it is now. But the job market was really tight. So when unemployment is 5%, 4%, it actually fell below 4% for a couple of months in the year 2000. Workers have a lot more bargaining power, and that's particularly germane in an economy without a lot of unionization. So low unemployment is a great solution. I'd say the other most important is probably the last bullet, the financialization. So much of our productive capacity in recent years has involved essentially what I would call financial arbitrage, which is sort of a fancy way of saying people figuring out ways to trade off of a price differential in a nanosecond through these very advanced computer algorithms. I don't believe that adds anything productive to the economy. I really don't. I mean, I'm convinced it doesn't. And in fact, if I had my way, there'd be a financial transaction tax that would probably dampen some of that activity and raise some serious revenue. So I would have an FTT, a financial transaction tax, and try to push back some on the financialization problems that I've mentioned.
You kind of touched on this already a little bit, I think, with the higher the unemployment, but you talked about equal opportunity not meaning equal outcome.
Right.
Without that correlation, how do you judge equal opportunity or the achievement of equal opportunity?
There's actually been a lot of research on this question. There's a very good book, if you're really interested in this, called Wither Opportunity. So it's, wither, W-H-I-T-H-E-R, implying that there's less. And the way this has been measured is by looking at kids starting out in an unequal income distribution. So you look at kids at the very bottom of the income scale, compare them to kids at the middle and the top, and you see how they've done in terms of outcome variables like college completion, or in academic testing. And what we found is even controlling for things like IQ, which is an imperfect measure, but trying to do your best to kind of control for merit, if you will. We found that the kids who have the most, the kids who start out in the most disadvantaged economic circumstances are doing least well on all the outcome measures that we're talking about. I'll describe a graph that I think is very good in this regard. It takes kids by how they scored in a standardized test in 8th grade. And it looks at college completion by income level and by those scores of these standardized tests. And what it finds is that high-scoring poor kids, so call the standardized test IQ. High IQ poor kids have the same college completion rates of low IQ rich kids. All right? So the most, meritorious or the most kind of gifted poor kids are actually completing college at the same rate as the least academically skilled rich kids. So it tells you that there's clearly an opportunity correlate to the inequality problem.
You've already mentioned that there's a need to collect more revenues in order to stimulate the recovery. You have not mentioned spending cuts. You have not mentioned the level of national debt. And you haven't gone so far as to call collecting more revenue income redistribution. Could you talk about these
Sure,
issues?
sure. So the collecting more revenue is absolutely directed at the question, I think was implicit in your question, of this issue of the national deficit or debt. Where are you going? Follow this guy. The reason we need to collect more revenue is not because I'm some sort of tax freak. It's because I view us as having what's called a structural budget deficit. It's fine to have a budget deficit when you're in a recession. In fact, you should. In fact, I'd argue that right now we probably need a slightly bigger budget deficit than we have, again, to offset the contraction in the private sector. But as the economy improves, that budget deficit needs to come down. We need to get on a sustainable budget path. And that's going to mean more tax revenue. We can't do it just on spending cuts alone. But spending cuts have to be part of the mix as well. The thing I'm here to tell you, you may find this to be good news. I'm not sure exactly where you're coming from with your question, but this may be something you consider salutary. We've actually cut $1.5 trillion in spending so far. This Congress, which gets a lot of flack for being dysfunctional, and I give it to them every chance I get, they've managed to cut $1.5 trillion over the next 10 years from their spending plans. Now, what does that number mean? I throw around these numbers like they mean something. Most of the budget plans that are out there, and I think this is very sound, argue that over 10 years we have a deficit. We need to reduce the deficit by about $4 trillion. So we're about 40% of the way there on spending cuts alone. But we can't get all the way on spending cuts. There has to be a combination of spending cuts and revenue increases. We've got 1.5 trillion spending cuts in the bank. That's why I argue we also need something on the revenue side.
I think we have to call it. It's 8:45. The debate starts at 9. This ends the formal part. Let's thank Dr. Bernstein again.